Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. One of the most salient and interesting aspects of the war in Ukraine, which in other respects so eerily calls to mind the attritional trench fighting of the Western Front in the First World War, is the seemingly omnipresent threat of what is still a relatively new technology, the drone. Whether Bayraktars or Lancets, small reconnaissance drones or long-range strike ones, both the Ukrainian and Russian armies have designed, bought, and deployed an astonishing variety of these new weapons. What does the proliferation of this new platform tell us about the role, or roles, drones are likely to play in the future? And what can we extrapolate from the rapid evolution of drone technology and tactics about the shape and dynamics of major state-on-state warfare in the coming decades? To discuss all this and more, I'm delighted to be joined again by a previous guest on this podcast, Dr. Mauro Gilli, Senior Researcher in Military Technology and International Security at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology's Center for Security Studies in Zurich. Dr. Gilli, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to join you again.
So, Dr. Gilli, it's been actually 2.5 years since our last episode in which we talked more about the diffusion of advanced military technologies and the paper you had written on that topic. Interestingly, we did also touch on drones, so I encourage the listeners to go and check out that episode. But today I'd like to talk, as I said in the intro, really about the evolution of drones that we've been seeing in the last couple of years. Of course, now we have kind of a petri dish of innovation and development going on in Ukraine, but it's a story that's sort of been picking up pace in the last years or so. And probably we'll focus mostly on the land domain, but if we have time, I'd certainly like to kind of pick your mind about what we're seeing in terms of naval operations in the Black Sea as well. But just to kind of get us started, as I said, in Ukraine, we've been seeing drones really kind of take center stage in a number of respects. Of course, they played a significant role right from the beginning. The Bayraktar was at some point kind of almost like a mythical meme on the internet together with the Javelin. But we're seeing really a proliferation of types, of use cases, FPV drones, long-range reconnaissance drones, strike drones on both sides. Now the Russians have really stepped up their game too. They've been buying, of course, from the Iranians, their Shaheeds, etc. And we're also seeing a kind of horizontal proliferation, right? We've seen drones in Gaza. Of course, the IDF uses them to a significant extent in urban combat, but we've seen also some videos from Hamas of kind of little FPV drones dropping RPG rounds. The Houthis have been using them. The recent Iran strike, etc. So just let's kind of get a kind of bird's eye picture of how you've been thinking about this over the last couple of years. How do you think we should make sense of the evolution, the very rapid evolution in drone warfare that we're seeing?
Thanks again for having me. Very important question, and it's also a very difficult question because it's easy to get lost in so many things that have been happening. So please feel free to stop me at any time if you feel that I'm talking too much. I don't want to sure. Overwhelm the readers with words. I would say, first of all, it's very important to kind of clarify that the word drone means a very broad range of technologies with extremely different capabilities, costs, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So the kind of a problem in the public and media domain with the discussion about these technologies that by just relying on one single term, it's very easy to conflate what one person means and what another person understands. So in this regard, I think we can just broadly divide it in three big categories. On the one hand, there are the type of drone everybody is mostly familiar with, the one you can buy at the grocery store, not the grocery store, but at electronic stores, right. Or slightly larger that have commercial agricultural applications. So these are fairly cheap technologies, and these are the one we have been seeing used mostly in close combat in Ukraine by both sides. And the latest evolution is the one you were mentioning, that first-person view drones. That is, some of these drones kind of carry an explosive that with a detonating device, and so they are used to strike mobile target with the drone really chasing mobile targets, being tanks, armored vehicles, people, so soldiers on the ground, whatever. So these are the kind of small platform, and of course they have very limited capabilities in terms of range, for example, payload, type of command control. So they rely on a direct line of sight, and therefore you cannot use them, for example, over buildings or over hills. And then we have a kind of immediate kind of drones capabilities. These are used mostly for surveillance. You mentioned the Lancet, the Lancet is slightly different, but the Orlan by Russia, other technologies that have slightly longer range, slightly higher altitude. They can also carry missiles or small missiles or explosives. So the TB2 potentially fits in this category as well. And then we have the high-end drones. So we talk about technologies that cost way more than jet fighters, like the Global Hawk, for example, the US produces, cost 200 millions. Consider that an F-35 nowadays, like this is the jet fighter Switzerland, as well as Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, and many other countries are buying, cost about 80, 90 million. So these drones is really high cost. So over the past few years, we have seen a lot of advances, and we have learned a lot more about how these technologies can be used. As you mentioned early in the war, the TB2, this is a Turkish drone in the medium category. It was used, and it became almost a mythical technology because it was used to counter the Russian invasion by Ukraine. And the role it served was first to spot advancing trucks, advancing tanks or armored vehicles, and either strike them or provide their geolocation to Ukrainian artillery that then would carry on attacks. In fact, what we now know is that these TB2 drones played a very minor role. Most of the killing of these advancing columns of Russian vehicles were destroyed by artillery, and the role of the TB2s was very short in time. This is not to deny the role they play, but in terms of time they were used, and also the amount of role they play was fairly limited. Since then, we have seen more of the type of smaller drones being used since the war shifted towards the Donbass. We have seen way more the use of smaller drones in the front lines, really for striking enemy positions, providing accurate geolocation of enemy positions, or as I was saying earlier, the FPV drones, the first-person view drones that are used to chase moving vehicles. So I'll stop here because, as I said, I don't want to talk too much, but this is just to condense in a couple minutes what we have seen over the past few years. Happy to go more in detail on anything.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. That gives us a really nice overview. And actually, one of the things you just mentioned, which is that now 2 years into the war, we know that 2 years ago, as you said, the Bayraktar played a role, maybe even a significant role in the first 6 weeks, 2 months, whatever it was. And also the Ukrainians didn't even have that many of them. But eventually, the Russians managed to figure out how to jam them, spoof them, take them down with missiles, whatever the case may be. And that's one of the things I'd like to touch on later on, because that is part of the dynamic we've been seeing. But let me go on to something which is a very, I think, interesting aspect of this whole kind of plethora of platforms and techniques and tactics that we've been seeing, which is the whole question of to what extent are drones in any real sense fundamentally new, or to what extent do they change the offense-defense balance, right? This is something you and several co-authors wrote about in a paper in 2022 in the journal Security Studies, the title is a very catchy title. Will the drone always get through offensive myths and defensive realities? And for people who know their pre-World War II history, they'll know that that's a reference to the Stanley Baldwin quote in the House of Commons when he famously said that basically you could never stop the bomber getting through. So that was a kind of from a different age, but a callback to that same idea that interestingly, a couple of years ago, I mean, you published this paper in 2022, and presumably you started writing it a couple of years before that. So maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever. There was certainly, at least in the journalistic domain, let's say, in the public debate about these things, there was the sense that drones would fundamentally make the offense easier. That they would be first of all, at least certain kinds of drones, right? Maybe medium and high end drones. They'd be difficult to intercept. A lot more actors could get their hands on them because they're a lot cheaper than many other platforms. They could have significant payload, et cetera, et cetera. And in this paper, you really kind of deconstruct this whole notion, and you take a close look at what are the actual fundamental technological realities behind some of these platforms. And you pointed out, together with your co-authors, that actually there are a number of ways in which one can call into question this assumption. A lot of these drones are very vulnerable to a whole series of countermeasures. So, but I don't want to steal your thunder. I'd like you to kind of tell us more about that. So give us a sense of why it was that, as I said, maybe certainly before the war in Ukraine started, maybe a couple of years before that, the prevalent assumption, or at least a strong assumption on the part of many, was that drones were really going to tilt the balance in favor of the offense. And what do you think has been kind of the actual practical lesson that we can take from the most recent examples? Maybe Ukraine certainly, but maybe also Armenia, Azerbaijan to some extent. Was that actually borne out by the facts?
Yeah, you provided an absolutely accurate summary of both the debate and the organization of our article. So thank you very much for doing it so well. That is exactly the case. So I would say for the past 10 years, and maybe even more, there has been a fairly broad agreement in the media, but also among many academics and even among some policymakers, that the type of medium drones I was discussing earlier, as well as the kind of high-end drones, make attacking easier, and therefore this is a type of weapons that was really going to revolutionize war politics, because it would make attacking way easier, and the kind of not having to commit personnel would deprive countries from the risk of losing military personnel, and that does further increase the risk of war. For this reason, over the past 10-15 years, there have been a couple of initiatives, more or less serious. Some were very high level, of, for example, banning or constraining the drones technologies, the sale of drones, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And even in the early phase of the war in Ukraine, I do remember there was this big emphasis on the role of the TB2s, the Turkish drone, with people not just doing fundraising, as I mentioned earlier, but saying that we needed to provide Ukraine with this weapon because it would have been a game changer. And in fact, we do know how things evolved. So, as I said, the TB2 played a role in the very early phase of the war in spotting columns of tanks, destroying a couple. But the big bulk of the destruction of Russian tanks, as I mentioned, was carried out by artillery. But the moment the war shifted towards the Donbass and Crimea, with very clear line of contact in which Russia had strong air defenses, the role of these type of drones completely disappeared. And this is not just my opinion. There were a couple of articles, one I remember in Foreign Policy, one in Foreign News, in which Ukrainian drone pilots were interviewed and were asked about how different type of drones, like the TB2, but produced by the US, the Grey Eagle, for example, how these type of drones would have helped Ukraine. And these drone pilots were replying, oh, look, this is not going to change because with 90% probability, they would be destroyed. And when I read those interviews, I was not surprised, because this is in fact a key limitation of this type of drones, that namely are fairly easy to detect, identify, track, and engage by modern air defenses, which means that the moment an aircraft like that takes off, it can be shot down with fairly high probability. And this is the main kind of argument we advance in this article you have already mentioned, and namely, so air defenses are an extremely capable technology, and this is the modern air defenses kind of were developed. So they emerged exactly after the speech by this British member of parliament, Baldwin, when he warned that it was impossible to stop German bombers. In fact, the UK at that time had started working on radar, and radar actually made his prediction wrong, because radar, in comparison to the alternative, that is visual detection, allows for day and night detection, allows for very long range. So at that time it was like 200, 250 kilometers. Nowadays it can go up to 600 kilometers. And then also detection in bad weather. And then also provides the opportunity for directional detection. So you can not only detect an incoming aircraft, but also pinpoint the area from which it's coming from. And so since World War II, air defenses have made massive advances in the capacity of detect aircraft, track them, and then also to engage them, especially with the development of surface-to-air missiles. And against this type of the threat of modern air defenses, most aircraft are extremely vulnerable. And this is why so many countries nowadays are buying or trying to develop stealth aircraft. Stealth aircraft being, the name is a misnomer, they are not stealth, they are not invisible, but they have a technology in terms of shape, material, and a couple of other features that try to postpone the moment of detection by radar systems so that they cannot be detected, identified, tracked, and therefore engaged. And aircraft that do not have this technology are extremely vulnerable, and this is why, as we try to explain in the paper, drones like the Turkish one I mentioned, or the American one, the Predator, the Reaper, these are the ones that were used in the global war on terror, as well as the Grey Eagle, the new one, are very vulnerable to air defenses.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. One thing that just popped into my mind is that, maybe one of the reasons why, people started thinking that, drones were this incredibly revolutionary technology, they would make attacking way easier, et cetera, is because for a long time, like for 2, maybe even 3 decades, the U.S. essentially did not have to fight a peer-to-peer conflict against, serious air defenses. I mean, I guess the closest thing that could kind of be compared to that was Iraq's air defenses. But in both Gulf Wars, the coalition forces managed to establish air dominance relatively quickly, and at the end of that campaign, in an absolute way. And certainly the Taliban had no air-to-air missiles or anything of that nature, right? So the drones could just stay in the air forever and be, absolutely safe. Do you think maybe that contributed?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, I do think it's. I cannot say whether it was the only factor, but definitively, I think. There are multiple things, of course, going on. But for people who kind of started to focus, whether in the journalistic domain, as policymakers, or as academics, so they started focus on international security during the age in which most of the threat is by non-state actors and terrorists. The type of exposure you have in terms of knowledge, things you read, things you hear, are about from those conflicts. And in this conflict, these drones can operate with impunity. That was the case of the US. And so it's easy to jump to the assumption, oh, look, if many other countries get these technologies, then it's going to be a big problem. In fact, I do remember quite prominent academics warning and saying, oh, these technologies could be used to carry out drone strikes over the US territory. Now, this claim now today may sound absurd, but this was just made like about 10 years ago. And so definitively what you said, I think, plays at least part of the role of what has happened. But yeah, as from what we now know, and the recent events in Israel, like the fact that Israel at the end of the day intercepted all these ballistic missiles, cruise missile, and drones that Iran shot at it, is further suggestive of the fact that the problem is not intercepting them. Now, this doesn't mean that you can always shoot them down, all of them. It is a probability game, so it's even high probability would allow for a couple of these drones to pass through, or you might run out of munition in a given outpost, and therefore you can detect the incoming drones or the incoming missiles, but you cannot shoot them down because you run out of missiles.
Right.
Or at one point it becomes so expensive. This is the game that Russia is trying to play in Ukraine to some degree, that you shoot very cheap drones, like this is the Ukrainian one, the Iranian one you mentioned, the Shahid, just because they are so cheap that it's not convenient for Ukraine to use way more expensive surface-to-air missile to shoot them down.
Right, it's a kind of interceptor sponge kind of
Exactly.
thing, right?
Exactly, yeah.
No, it's so interesting, the various kind of tactics that are evolving, right? And that's the thing. I mean, in the last, as I say, the West was off fighting its, quixotic campaigns in Afghanistan or wherever. The Russians and the Chinese weren't just sitting around twiddling their thumbs, right? They had seen what we did to Iraq in both Gulf Wars, and they very logically came to the conclusion that we have to deny the West air dominance, right? So they set about doing exactly that, and we're seeing now in Ukraine that what it means to fight a state, right, and not just a militant group. A state has enormous resources at its disposal. It can throw money at the problem, like with the Shaheeds and to some extent also with the Lancets, etc. And it can also really up the tempo in terms of innovation. And this is something I'd like to ask you about, because I read recently that, and this is kind of an astonishing kind of statistic / factoid, that apparently the electronic warfare suites on some of these drones are basically getting jammed or spoofed or rendered ineffective in one way or another within really only a couple of months of being introduced on the battlefield. So the turnover rate in terms of not just the actual platform, like the actual building of the thing and shipping it to the front line and all of that, but of course ultimately these are electromagnetic spectrum kind of weapons. They rely on the electromagnetic spectrum to work. So the innovation rate is extraordinary. Tell us a little bit about that and what it means about, again, the kind of the cycle of offense defense.
Great question. I've not read the article you mentioned. So when we finish, if you could send it to me, I would be very interested in reading. But I would say it's not surprising. So because this is very consistent with the history of electronic warfare. Definitively what we saw in World War II, the very early stage of electronic warfare, then what we saw in Vietnam, and then what we've seen a lot in the past, like 20, 30 years. So just to make sure that those who listen, maybe some of them do not have full understanding of electronic warfare. It's very, very simple, way less complicated than the name might suggest. It's just the use of all those spectrum that includes visible light, as well as radio waves, as well as radar waves, microwaves, for communication at long range, including radar detection, tracking, and so forth. So this is extremely useful because, as I was mentioning earlier about radar, the use of the electronic spectrum works day and night. It works for most of the frequencies in good and in bad weather, and then it works at very, very long ranges. Because it's so effective, of course, defense electronics engineers have worked hard since World War II to deny the opponent the use of the electronic spectrum, which in the case of drones might simply mean just interfering with the radio signal that allowed the drone operator to command the drones. And of course, this is an extremely effective way to counter the enemy drones. That is, if you impede the operator to use the drones given over a specific area, then you deny him access to a technology that he has invested. And as I said, so I don't know, I'm not familiar with the article, but the history of electronic warfare is exactly the history of measure and countermeasure and countermeasure. In fact, the whole field is called electronic warfare, and then it has a subtitles, electronic countermeasure and electronic countermeasures, and so forth, because the never-ending fight for vulnerabilities in the other system that can be exploited to interfere again with whether it's detection, tracking, communication, whatever it is. So the goal is to really deny the use of the electronic spectrum to the enemy. So it's important to keep in mind electronic warfare is not something that you just push a button and you switch off the light. So it's localized. So it's essentially like putting a flashlight in your enemy's eyes as a way to interfere with a very specific platform. So you need to interfere with a radio signal. But when you do, then it's the effectiveness can be quite significant.
Right. And one of the kind of interesting aspects about that, of course, is that, and this is something that the IDF has been having to deal with a lot, obviously in the very restricted sort of claustrophobic confines of Gaza, is that, of course, the electronic warfare countermeasures that you put up to deny the enemy his drones can also end up, creating, essentially conflicts in the electromagnetic spectrum for your own drones, right? So then it becomes this interesting cat and mouse game in terms of who, there's always a trade-off, right, between denying the spectrum or a certain part of the spectrum for the enemy, but also at the same time having enough spectrum for your own drones to be able to work at all. So
absolutely, and we also need to consider, for example, with the small drones we were talking at the beginning, there are problem of conflicting spaces. That is, you cannot use multiple drones at the same time in a small area because the radio interference is going to kind of create problems. At one point, you can start controlling a different drones from the one you thought you were controlling, and you create a lot of mess. So there are also problems for one country because these are complicated technologies, and therefore they pose different type of problems.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And again, it goes to show the complexity of the whole issue, right? It's not just about buying a bunch of drones for, these quadcopters or whatever from China. I mean, one thing is having the platform. It's another thing to be able to actually deploy it in the battlefield. I mean, this for me, it brings to calls to mind again the conversation we had last time, right? About it's not just the technology itself; it's also about how deploying it, knowing when to use it, how to use it, etc. So this brings up I think a key question here, which is this idea of the cost curve, right? Where on the cost curve do you want to be? Now, certainly with both in Ukraine, but also with the recent Iranian strike on Israel, obviously the defenses in Israel were very successful. Whatever the interception rate was, 99%, 98%, whatever. I certainly don't know, but in any case, it was very high. Although not 100%, but certainly the American officials and also Israeli officials have quite openly acknowledged that even though the actual defense this time was as I said very successful, it's really not where you want to be on the cost curve because the interceptors are very, very expensive together with the platforms that direct the whole thing. Whereas as we mentioned earlier with the Shahed 136s. The bullets, as it were, that are coming your way can be way cheaper. So in the long run, there has to be a better solution. Right now, there's a lot of talk about lasers and all of that, but those are those guzzle electricity worse than an Abrams tank guzzles oil or diesel, I guess. So there are problems with that too. But I'm curious how you think about this problem, because what do you think are the lessons? I mean, obviously, it's early days in the conflict still, but are there any lessons we can draw about where on the which parts of the cost curve make sense and which don't? Are there any kind of platforms or technologies that we can kind of start to rule out, let's say?
Another great question and really, really difficult. I would say that definitively this is a serious problem, because when brought to scale, few countries can sustain defending their airspace for very long time. And this is not just a matter of cost per se. I mean, Israel has a GDP, or the US has a GDP that is, I don't know how many times larger than that of Iran. So, even if the attack for Iran is way cheaper than the defense it is for whether Israel or for the US, then the differential in GDP, in absolute values of GDP, kind of compensates for that. This is still a problem, though, let me be very clear. But the bigger issue at stake for me is that the cost of the intercepting missile, the surface-to-air missile to intercept incoming drones, reflects the production process behind them, which means that these missiles cannot just be produced, in short time at some commercial factory that you convert a need. You need to have specialized engineers, specialized workers, specialized supply chain, specialized production plants, specialized lab for testing, and way, 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 way more. I could go literally for hours to talk about all the specialized things you need. Mm-hmm. And we do know that Western countries, but this is true for most countries in general, do not have the production capacity to be able to withstand an attack similar to the one Israel kind of was victim of for a long period of time. And this is the same reason why in the past month, we have started to see footage coming from Ukraine of Russian jet fighters kind of daring into Ukrainian territory, something they were not doing it just 3 months ago. The reason being that in some areas, Ukrainian air defenses have run out of precise munitions, that is surface-to-air missiles, and therefore Russian aircraft feel fairly confident. Not as daring as go all the way to Kyiv, of course, but they feel they can dare and push a bit inward. So this is a big, big problem because, as I said, the supplies is inevitably limited. Moreover, now with the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, tension in East Asia, especially with regard to Taiwan, but of course we cannot forget the threat of North Korea. So there are a lot of areas in the world where these very type of technologies, this very type of surface-to-air missiles are needed. And therefore, this becomes a big issue for Western countries. That is, can you sustain this type of situation for a very long time? I don't have an answer. I don't think most people have an answer, but it's definitely something that is worth pondering because very different type of policies would be needed depending on the answer one gives. And so this is how I would put it. And to answer more precisely your question, I think the lesson we learned from Ukraine is that what Ukraine has been trying to do is to use surface-to-air missiles mostly for high value targets, like incoming bombers, AWACS, kind of these type of big platforms. Mm-hmm. And as much as possible rely on short range engagement systems for the smaller drones. So my understanding is that there are overnight in Ukraine, there are these kind of trucks that carry anti-air artillery systems. So this is a fairly short range, short altitude ceiling, but it's sufficient to engage, to try to shoot down the Iranian drones. And they kind of drive at full speed on the highway as soon as they are warned of an incoming drone. So that what they try to do is to shoot down these missiles with artillery, because the key is we want to save the missiles for the higher end type of platforms. And that definitively is what most countries would have to do in a situation like that.
Right. This would be the German Gepard platform,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that may be the way to go in terms of at least you're shooting it down with very inexpensive shells or sort
Exactly.
of specialized bullets. Although in that with that platform you're taking out the drone or the platform at a very late stage, right?
Yeah, absolutely, because they have an absolutely critical point. They have altitude ceiling. It depends, like maybe 2 kilometers, three. I don't remember, but
Hmm.
it's not like 10 kilometers.
Right.
And then, of course, this also means they have a short range, so you cannot engage them. Like surface-to-air missiles can engage a missile at 50, 60, or even more kilometers, depending. With these artilleries, yeah, you have a short range, so it's good to defend, like a specific city, for example, or a
Hmm.
specific type of critical infrastructure. Uh, you cannot deny, like in this case, what it means is that very likely some of the drones will go through, so they will end up hitting some of your housing, highways, whatever it is, because it becomes very difficult to intercept them all. Yeah.
Right, right. And one thing that just popped into my mind just now, as you were speaking, is that the kind of countermeasure, to go back to that earlier analogy, that the Russians have more recently started using is these glide bombs, right? Where you take basically a dumb bomb and you just kind of lob it, which is actually a kind of what they had started doing with their attack helicopters too, right? They would do
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
weird like kind of jet ramp maneuver. And just lob shells kind of indiscriminately in a general direction and then scoot back to their line. So they've started doing that. So it's again, it just goes to show that when we talk about these things, we have to remember the way these platforms would actually be deployed, or the doctrine that would actually be kind of the brains behind the whole operation. And one way to overwhelm your enemy's defenses is to force him into this whack-a-mole game, right? Where you have interceptors here, but kind of anti-air artillery over there, and then you don't have enough of either, etc. And certainly, if Western production of artillery shells is anything to go by, which is a pretty sorry sight, then we have a big problems on our hands when it comes to producing large numbers of more expensive, more sophisticated interceptors.
Yeah, this is exactly the key point. There was an article in The Economist a couple of weeks ago discuss exactly, and a couple articles also, I think, in the Financial Times, say exactly what you just said. That is, it becomes very, very problematic because at the end of the day, on the one hand, Russia doesn't care what it's hitting. It's just shooting missiles, and the point is to inflict destruction and death. But these bombs are very cheap, and so the choice of, okay, how many of them can we engage, or which can we really engage, like trying to predict the trajectory, that becomes a very, very difficult game, because at the end of the day, it means that you need to accept that some of them will strike your territory, and you have a huge, not only cost advantage, as we were saying earlier, but also production problem advantage, which means that these old kind of rudimentary unguided bombs are in plenty of supply for Russia. And conversely, modern surface-to-air missiles are not for Ukraine. And so the cost aside, there is a supply or stock problem that is fundamental here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'd like to kind of try and wrap things up as we come slowly towards the end with a kind of overarching question, which I've been thinking about, which is this whole notion of the battlefield becoming more transparent, right? This idea that it will be more difficult to hide, essentially. That maybe drones didn't tilt the offense defense balance, but maybe to some extent they have tilted the finder seeker balance, or the finder or the seeker hider balance, right? To some extent. So how do you think about that? Because one of the lessons I think that the Ukrainians drew, and kind of observers in general, from the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year, which obviously didn't go as planned, was that, first of all, it turns out it's, old, old, tried and true methods like mining the hell out of an area and creating trenches and anti-tank ditches and all of that is still effective if done properly. And the Russians had time to do that because we the West didn't send the Ukrainians enough weapons, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. And so that was one thing they did. But the other thing is that drones, the Russian drones, made it very difficult for the Ukrainians to achieve the element of surprise or even to mass at all, right? To mass the little armor that they did have. And so we saw Abrams tanks getting immobilized. We saw Leopard tanks getting immobilized and destroyed. And some people drew the conclusion, oh, well, the tank in general, or the tank as such, or the Abrams in particular, or the Leopard in particular, whatever, that there's some problem with them. But kind of it seems to me that the deeper point here is that both with the initial Russian offensive and then with the Ukrainian counteroffensive, we saw two offensive thrusts essentially fail. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons certainly has to be that it's getting more difficult to achieve enough concentration at any decisive point in the battlefield because you're always being looked at. So what do you think, first of all, to what extent is that true in your opinion? Secondly, if it is true, or at least to some extent true, then what do you think are the consequences here? I mean, this seems like a pretty radical shift, especially for the Western way of war, which is all about maneuver, decisive
surprise.
Fires, etc. Surprise, exactly.
Yeah, another great question and another very difficult answer. But I would say, to some degree at least, it is true. Drones are part of it. There is much more, like the emerging constellation of satellites, for example. I mean, this is something that 20 years did not exist. Like, satellite coverage was limited, spotty, and now it's possible to have, constellation of satellites that have multiple different type of sensors. Again, they use the electromagnetic spectrum, but the different frequencies. So you have infrared, you have low frequencies, high frequencies, wide bands, and all these allow you to think about taking a picture of multiple shades of colors. And so with each different shade, you can see better some details than others, right? Mm-hmm. So in one color, for example, you can better see metal objects. With another color, you can see better people. And when you merge them all together, which you can do with advanced algorithm, powerful computing capabilities, and of course, machine learning and so forth, that becomes quite a drastic change. And is it just going to be a permanent feature? Well, the history of warfare tells us that is, again, a history of war, measure and countermeasure. So there are potential countermeasures. We do know that Ukrainian soldiers in the early phase of the war, they were using yoga mats, foam mats to move in the hoods at night so as to cover their thermal signature from thermal cameras. So you can use countermeasures, but of course these countermeasures have their limitations and impose constraints on operations. So it's one thing if you need a couple of special soldiers to advance at night in any territory. It's completely different if you need to go in advance with tanks. This is very, very different. And like there was this famous interview in the Economist from the Ukrainian chief of staff, Zaluzny, who kind of pointed out what you summarized, saying, well, it's very difficult to try a counteroffensive when the enemy can monitor 24/7 the area it has already fortified and can detect any minor movement and shell you with long-range artillery as soon as you advance. So it's under these circumstances, going in the advance is very, very difficult. So to reply kind of more precisely, I don't know whether we are at the kind of drastic change for the foreseeable future. Definitively, many of the ingredients are here and we have seen them. So this is something that Western countries are definitively paying a lot of attention to. because this is going to be a key features of the next couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can't resist a little joke here. I mean, what you just mentioned about the soldiers using yoga mats to hide their thermal signature makes me want to say that may be the best use yoga mats have been put to in the last decade or so, since yoga became a thing in the West. But that's just my little quip. Before I let you go, Dr. Gilli, I want to mention also for the listeners, because this ties in very nicely to what we've just talked about, that maybe, at least, as you said, the history of warfare will go on, and if the seekers maybe have an advantage now, maybe tomorrow the hiders will have an advantage, or we'll certainly find ways to reply. But one of the best places left to hide, maybe the only place really left to hide, is under the sea. And you have a very interesting paper which was just published on War on the Rocks, I believe, or the Texas National Security Review. I forget which one it was. Yeah. That readers can find online. A very interesting paper on the effects of climate change on anti-submarine warfare, because, of course, one of the effects of climate change is rising sea temperatures, which have a direct correlation with acoustic propagation under the water. So interested listeners should definitely check that out. I also want to mention for the listeners where people can find you on Twitter. Your handle is at Mauro_Gilli. Is there any other place where people can look for your work, or is Twitter /X?
Yeah, I use a bit LinkedIn, but not much, and I don't have Instagram, so I would say Twitter is still the best.
Twitter is the place to be. All right, great. Okay, well, this was a fascinating conversation. I'm so glad we found the time to arrange this. It's been really interesting. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for the invitation. It was very nice to be back, and happy to be in the future as well to talk more about these topics.